Today I've got none other than David Congdon with me. David, it's been, I think, just over a year now, but I bet you have been on the podcast on average once a year for the last 4, 5, 6 years. Who's counting at this point? You're very much a regular at this point. I think you and Tom Ord have been on the podcast the most, and so I don't know who's winning the title right now for the most guest appearances, but you and Tom Ord are definitely in the running.
Yeah, I'm great to be in company with Tom, so that's fantastic.
Yeah, he's a great person to be in company with. Even if you disagree with him theologically, he's a great person to be in company with. So, well, for those that don't know you, even though they should go back and listen to all those old episodes that you're in, if they don't know you, who is David Congdon to David Congdon?
Um, David Congdon is sort of this quasi theologian of sorts. I'm trying to figure out what my title, role, space is these days. But I'm a jack of all trades these days. I'm an editor. I'm a theologian. I'm a professor, and just sort of trying to make the world a little bit better with with some informed conversation and
Yeah.
writing about theology and politics.
Love that. Love that. It does seem like you found like this interesting little niche of, doing the editor, book publishing world. You've got a little bit of the professorship world. Then you're obviously doing some of your writing as well. And so it does kind of feel like this little interesting place that kind of, you're able to fulfill a lot of the different sides of you that I think you want to be fulfilled. And you've kind of found like a little spot for that. And, I would imagine, especially with this like theology job market, it's probably pretty devastating to, get a PhD and think, okay, I'm going to become a tenured track professor, and then find out that that just probably is unlikely. But to be able to still find like a little niche where you're able to do a little bit all the things that you love, that's got to be kind of cool, right?
It's very cool, and I'm really lucky, honestly. I mean, I'm in a great position. I have the freedom to write what I want to write, to research what I want to research, and I can't complain. I'm teaching now at University of Kansas here, and I'm really excited about it. So things have been great.
Love that. Love that. Well, let's start. Let's talk about your new book. Who is a true Christian? Contesting religious identity in American culture. I still remember maybe a year or two ago when you first started writing this, and we're in maybe one or two group chats, and I remember you kind of throwing this one out as a possibility. I was like, oh boy, this is going to be a doozy. And so, I'm really excited to chat about it. But I would imagine kind of your maybe interest in this question around who is a true Christian probably begins with the beginning of your story. And I know you've talked a little bit about your story before on the podcast, but I would imagine a lot of this question for you comes with growing up in conservative evangelicalism. So yeah, can you talk a little bit about maybe the story behind this very important question?
Yeah, I mean, the story for sure is very personal to me. I mean, growing up, I had a very narrow view of what Christianity was. Like a lot of evangelicals, Christianity. I mean, I remember this funny story, and my parents are wonderful. They are truly incredible people. But there was this funny moment where I remember I was reading Mennenga, Wrinkle in Time, those books, and I asked, I knew she had some sort of Christian connections, and I asked my parents, who is she a Christian? And their response was, she's 99% Christian. And, and so I thought, okay. So she's mostly Christian, not totally Christian because she wasn't an evangelical, but she was close, she was sort of, adjacent, Christian adjacent. I had my best friend growing up was Lutheran, and also that similar situation. I went to a Lutheran church camp with him one summer, and I remember again my parents were like, "Yeah, they're mostly Christian," and so growing up, I had this sense that Christianity was very clearly defined by what I grew up in, which was a kind of dispensationalist,
Right.
far right fundamentalist evangelicalism. That the left behind kind of mentality, that was my world.
Right.
And that didn't change for me. I didn't even know that there was a Christianity outside of that, like a legitimate Christianity outside of that, until I went to college. And so, I mean, this book is certainly the fruit of a lifetime of sort of wrestling with this question: who gets to count as Christian? Now, the more personal anecdote here is just that I was fired for being a heretic, for violating the
Yeah.
boundaries of Christianity. And that certainly was what precipitated the writing of this book.
Right. Yeah, that was, I mean, obviously I have a very similar story. I would imagine most of my listeners have a somewhat similar story of at least growing up in conservative evangelicalism. And at some point in a lot of people's like deconstruction process or whatever they would call it, at some point that question around like, wait, like who actually is like a true Christian, especially once you start learning about the breadth of Christian belief and Christian tradition. It's like, wait, like the way that a lot of us have grown up defining Christianity hasn't been the way that Christianity has been defined at all for a long, long time. And so it does seem to be like a core question for those who deconstruct their conservative evangelicalism.
Very much so. Yeah.
Yeah. You mentioned a little bit about kind of at some point, getting fired for, not being like a true Christian or whatever. And I have like a similar story too, where I was working at, what's funny is like, at this point I was like very much like a progressive Christian. I was in seminary. I was learning process theology and all the stuff that, I'm really into. And it was right after I had graduated college. There was a very conservative Christian school that I was working at. That was substitute teaching. I was kind of like their full-time sub, and the school was mostly, it wasn't directly connected with Bethlehem Baptist, but it was very connected. A lot of the people that started this school were Bethlehem Baptist people, which for those that don't know, that's John Piper's old church. So it's very much like John Piper kind of place, right? Which is hilarious, knowing me. But there was one time where I was talking with a couple. So actually, let me back up. For maybe a year, I had been waiting to substitute teach in the theology, for the theology teacher. And finally, one day after like a year or whatever, substitute teaching at the school, I was finally able to substitute teach for him. And so here I am, like substitute teaching, and especially at that level of like high school, whatever, like the subs, they don't do anything. Like I wasn't doing anything. I was just there to make sure no one dies, essentially. I like. They were like maybe towards like doing their final projects or whatever, and so I'm talking to this like group of girls and just asking them like, hey, what are you working on your final project for? And one of the girls mentioned that she was like doing this whole like free will versus predestination debate kind of thing, and I'm like, oh, that's wonderful. And then she was like, well, Mr. Mason, where are you where do you land on all of that? I'm like, oh boy. So I wanted to be honest with her, but I also am like very aware where like, with my sort of process theology influences, I'm like, I know that this is probably going to like land in a territory where they're not expecting. And so anyway, I was just like very honest, but I was very clear, like, hey, that's what I believe, like that. I don't expect you to believe any of that. Like, I don't even expect the school to believe any of that. I'm just indicating what I believe. Next day, I get called into the principal's office, like one of the high schoolers themselves, and have to navigate like, okay, this is like clearly what the school believes. And basically, I was like, here's the deal. Like, I know I'm like your only full-time sub. Like, the school would become like in disarray if you fired me. So here's the deal. Like, I will agree that that's what you believe, but it does not, like, outside of these walls, it's not at all what I believe. And they were kind of at like a point where they're like, okay, like we can deal with that. That's fine. So anyway, like I would imagine a lot of us have, especially those who like were in evangelicalism to a point where they were like professionals, like, they were working at churches or whatever. A lot of people have that story of just like navigating this, what is true Christian belief. And not only is it sort of like this existential theological question, but it actually is a professional question where it could affect you financially.
Yeah, I mean, exactly. I talk about this in the book where, one of the things I point out is sort of the way we sort of allow the language of orthodoxy and true Christianity to mask the differences that we all know exist. We all know our communities are rife with massive differences of belief on so many core, but we just sort of agree to just not talk about it. It's like, don't ask, don't tell. We just don't ask about, what do you really think about the virgin birth or whatever, some Christian doctrine that might be of deep importance. We just don't talk about it. We'll say the creed, we'll do whatever we need to do to maintain the veneer of uniformity. And that's good enough. We all just kind of accept that. It's sort of a social contract in Christianity.
Yeah, I'm curious for you, like what was maybe that first initial catalyst for rethinking this question. Like for me, there was like there was a historical piece to this of just learning the history of Christianity and realizing like, wait, there's so much diversity of belief and practice that like we can't claim some level of uniformity. So that was important for me. And then also I started having this question around, I remember going to these big youth group conferences and, thousands of kids would come down and, pray the sinner's prayer and give their life to Jesus. And I bet half of them never stepped foot in a church ever again. Yep. Or maybe not quite that high, but like, I bet there was a huge group of those people that like supposedly gave their life to Christ and never have stepped foot in a church again. But from an evangelical perspective, that person's a Christian, but the person who, let's say, lived their entire life as a Catholic and but maybe on their deathbed they don't believe one certain little thing that evangelicals believe. All of a sudden that person's not a Christian, but they've like dedicated their entire life. Or let's say it's somebody who was actually a conservative evangelical, and let's say they have like some something with like dementia or some sort of memory loss, where then all of a sudden they forget that it's Jesus that they pray to or whatever, right? Like what happens in that case? Does that person, even though in the midst of their memory loss, like does that person cease to become Christian? And so those kind of questions really made me really realize, oh wait, there's a historical piece to this, but also like theologically, it doesn't seem to make much sense either. So I'm just curious for you, what was the initial catalyst to really start reconsidering this question of who is a true Christian?
I mean, okay, so there are two moments that really stand out for me, and this ties into my history with the question of universalism too, which of course is a big topic that we've talked about before. I would say, in retrospect, the first moment for me was when my grandfather died, and that was when I was 10 years old, and he had never been a Christian, never practiced Christianity or anything, but I remember my mom telling me that she had went out and prayed with him on his deathbed to accept Jesus as his savior, and that secured his eternal destiny, right? And for me, I just felt this overwhelming sense of that is absurd, right? There's no way that should have determined whether he was going to spend eternity with God, right? And like, he was a wonderful person, genuinely, like truly great, grandfather and a person. And so like, there was no doubt in my mind that God loved him, right? That was just no doubt whatsoever. So like that both was a catalyst for me realizing I never really accepted the traditional doctrines of hell and salvation, but it also meant that it planted the seed for me to ask these questions about who gets to count as Christian. I would say the intellectual moment, though, where that became like conscious, reflective for me, was between my freshman and sophomore years in college, where I read Mark Noll's The Scandal of the Evangelical Mind. And that was the moment that I discovered that the young earth creationism that I grew up with was not the universally held position of the church. And I remember, it was such a shocking moment for me to realize that this view that I thought was one of the definitive positions in Christianity had only been around for, at that point, 50 years, that just blew my mind. And it also completely shattered my sense of Christianity and what it meant to be Christian.
Yeah. You mentioned like that 50-year period of, that specifically young earth creationism has been only around for 50 years. And, there's a good argument to be made that at least like our modern conception around like the rapture is a very recent invention as well. And even like, I know there's a lot of arguments that even would argue that modern biblical inerrancy is a very recent invention. And so one of the things, at least in conservative evangelicalism, I don't know if like other forms of, whether it may be Eastern Orthodoxy or Catholicism does this as much, but there are so many things that are so recently invented in evangelicalism, but they present it as if it's the historic position. And it's absolutely unbelievable the way that they're able to sort of market it that way. I don't know if you have thoughts around that, but it's absolutely unbelievable to me that they're able to market these things where they're able to convince a bunch of people that these are the historic held beliefs. And it's like it's just factually not.
Well, I mean, yes. I mean, I could talk about this all day. I mean, I remember once preaching in a church back in Philadelphia where I was a pastoral intern, and I had somebody come up to me after the service, and we were talking, and And he was saying, it's absolutely essential that biblical inerrancy is definitive for what it means to be a Christian. I said, look, I mean, that's a position that's maybe a few hundred years old at best, several hundred years. And then he said, true Christianity is only a few hundred years old. There were no Christians before that. and I just like, I just stood there stunned, and was like,
That's like, there's like the question, like, was what was Plato saved? Like, there's that question around, like,
yeah.
is Plato saved? Like, was John Calvin saved?
I mean, yeah, exactly. I mean, I cannot comprehend that way of thinking. I mean, but there certainly are people who do think that way, I mean, the King James Bible, that you don't have Christians before that because they didn't have that Bible. I mean, it's certainly a position people hold. I don't know how to make sense of it. I don't think you can make sense of it, but
Right.
but it does raise this problem in a really profound way.
Yeah. When did this question of the essence of Christianity become so important within Christianity? Was this something that started very early on, right away with the first followers of Jesus, or was this something that eventually developed later on? I'm just really curious, like, when did this start becoming such an important priority for so many Christians?
Right. No, it's not ancient. It really does not really begin in earnest until maybe the High Middle Ages. I think the concept of the essence of Christianity is a really interesting one, and I wish I could have written a whole history of just that term. People have done it, but at least in German. But the idea of the essence of Christianity is really a post-Protestant Reformation idea. There are antecedents in the Middle Ages where it begins to form among the mystics. So people like Meister Eckhart, Johannes Teuler, people who are doing mystical theology in that period, they begin to develop this idea of the essence as this, as something that's utterly transcendent, right? It's beyond church, it's beyond doctrine, it's beyond the institutions of Christianity. And that's where the real depth, the real heart of Christianity resides. So mysticism has been this kind of tradition and current where this talk has flourished. And then the Reformation was born out of mysticism. Luther was reading these German mystics and was heavily inspired by them. So I do think the Reformation is in that tradition of mysticism. And so that talk of the essence sort of filters into the Reformation from those earlier mystical sources. And it takes on a different language at this point, but the same talk is happening. It doesn't really become a problem, though, until you have the Enlightenment, right? And then the Enlightenment sort of shatters the traditional doctrines, right? So the traditional doctrines were all in place. You had the essences sort of like alongside of them. But once the Enlightenment comes along and people start to question the traditional doctrines and texts, the essence arises as a way to preserve Christianity in the face of the loss of those doctrines. So it sort of becomes independent at that point from the traditional doctrinal stream of Christianity.
Right. So you're kind of like placing it around like, post Reformation. I'm curious, like, how do you think of this question around like the essence of Christianity, or at least the priority of that question? How do you place that in light of the creeds and the development of the creeds? Because I think a lot of people would point back to, well, clearly the creeds are a good indication that Christians cared about the essence of Christianity early on.
Sure.
Like, I'm curious, like, how do you think through that?
So the way I kind of distinguish between the rule of faith or the creeds from the essence is that the essence of Christianity is something that is independent of the ecclesiastical institutions. In other words, it can maintain its identity, its authority and power, regardless of whether the church is supportive of it or not. Right? It sort of transcends those structures. Whereas the rule of faith, the creeds, the canons, all of those confessions of different sorts, those are inherently ecclesiastical documents. So yes, they are like, the Nicene Creed or whatever, those are certainly articulating, at least in their minds, what we might call the essence. But in my kind of history of this concept, I argue that the idea of an essence as something that we need to strive for, that we need to find and articulate, that's only a modern problem, because it's only in modernity that we have the ability to question those institutions of traditional Christianity. So basically, the modern period is the period in which the ecclesiastical structures that upheld the canons and the rules of faith and the creeds, those came under question. And at that point, people began to pursue the essence of Christianity as a way to replace that.
It's interesting, like, just to think like back to maybe some of those first Christians. Like, are you like maybe suggesting that like they didn't care so much about this question around like what the essence of Christianity is? Was it something that they had? Maybe they were aware of that question and they just rejected it. Was it something it wasn't even something to consider? I'm just really curious, like,
Yeah.
how would you have thought, like, yeah, I know it's sort of maybe it's something that you can't really place onto a early Christian, but I'm just curious, like, how did they think of that at all? Did they not think of that? I'm just curious.
I mean, certainly we see in Justin Martyr and Tertullian and others a concern to articulate a rule or a guide that is definitive of what we might say, this is what defines Christianity. So when we see that going way back, I mean, even in the letters of Paul, we see them debate over this issue, right? These kind of fractions and, I mean, the factions and divisions are all over, who gets to count here as a member of this movement. I would say, so, I mean, certainly the rule of faith is what it comes down to. So we have different groups debating who has a monopoly on the truth, who has the real truth. So Irenaeus is saying those Gnostics over there are clearly outside the boundaries of the real apostolic tradition, apostolic faith. They're not Christian. We are. So I guess in a sense we could say that they are debating the essence of Christianity. I think it's a little bit murky there just because there isn't really any sort of agreed upon orthodoxy at this point. There's each individual theologian has the ability to sort of present their take on the rule of faith. None of that really ever gets sorted out. And there doesn't even seem to be any sort of felt need to sort it out until Constantine, until the empire takes on Christianity and decides it's actually a politically expedient question what Christianity is, because now it's a political problem. Before that, I think people were perfectly fine. One group over here in Jerusalem can disagree with the Antioch people, can disagree with the Ephesus people. It doesn't matter. As long as we're practicing these communities and we're part of these different communities of faith, we're all good. We're sharing bread together, we're meeting together for our various liturgies, and that's all fine. It wasn't really a felt need to say this alone really is Christianity, and that doesn't happen until the Roman Empire decides it has to be.
Talk more about that moment of what is it about the Roman Empire and sort of this co-opting of Christianity that now makes this felt need of, okay, we got to figure out some sort of essence here.
Yeah, well, we definitely we see this kind of gradual building of anger and division and ferment in these early centuries, where certain theologians are, they're all fighting with each other. It's a lot of bickering, a lot of anger. People want to kick each other out of their various, communities and leadership roles. And so I think when Constantine comes along, there's certainly a group of bishops who realize that this moment gives them the ability to basically expel their opponents from the church. And so, that's a crude way of putting it, but I do think the documents bear it out. I mean, Athanasius and others were politically savvy and pugnacious and quite willing to play political power games in order to make sure that their position got supremacy over the alternative positions. And so Constantine is a complicated figure. A lot of people like to blame him as being the person who sort of created this problem. I don't think that's really entirely fair to Constantine. He's a very savvy politician. He's weighing in his own mind who the parties are that are best going to suit his concern for political peace, right? I do think a lot of the blame falls on the bishops who decided to use Constantine to their political advantage. and clearly did so as an effort to oust their opponents, their theological opponents. And so
This
that,
sounds nothing
yeah,
familiar at all, like that's happening today.
right. I mean, it's really, I mean, these political power games are as old as humanity, right? That's part, nothing much has changed under the sun. So, I think when we look at Augustine, for example, Augustine was also a savvy politician, quite ready and willing to go to the emperor to get Pelagius booted out of the church. And so he just manufactures a new heresy, Pelagianism. This is a heresy. Let's get the emperor to declare it so and rid this guy. And he succeeds. And so is it theology? Yes. Is it politics? Yes. And they're all sort of vying for power.
Right. Yeah, I mean, the question of who is a true Christian is really a question around authority, who has authority, and specifically the kind of authority, at least you're talking about here, is political authority, obviously. And again, I think that is like totally the reason why this is such a central question to evangelicalism now. Is evangelicalism realizes if they want political authority, they really have to narrowly define who is a true Christian. So yeah, I don't know if you, I don't know if I really have any specific question around that, but maybe you have specific thoughts around the fact that this sort of political game that was played almost 1700 years ago is the same game that's being played now among evangelicals.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, that's sort of the larger goal of my book, is to expose that this has always been around in this question, and Christians have this in some ways naive, sometimes kind of ignorant, just or whatever sense that they're just talking about these truths of revelation, that there's no politics involved, right? It's just about accessing the truth of God. It's just about being a neutral, objective transmitter of the tradition that's always been there, and I think. And what I want people to kind of come to grips with is realize that Christians have always been involved in the construction of these mechanisms of power and decisions about who gets to count, whose voice gets to have a place in this conversation.
Mm-hmm. This kind of brings me to Trump, because Trump, I think, at least in terms of modern American politics and this particular question, maybe exposes the question more, because like at least previously with evangelical political leaders, I mean, they were the people that, they went to church, you went to some Southern Baptist church, they all went to Liberty, right? Like they did the thing that were sort of the fruits, if you will, of being an evangelical in order to, gain political power. But Trump throws a wrench in this, in the fact that he in no way, shape, or form has ever demonstrated any fruit of being an evangelical Christian. And yet he is being used as this pawn to like basically prove your Christianity now. Like if you're for Trump, you're a Christian. And if you're not, then you're not a Christian. And so it's just really interesting how he's sort of the very question around, or at least how that question of who's a true Christian has been answered by evangelicals. Trump is not a Christian according to evangelicals, but because he's willing to give them political power, they're now starting to change that definition. So I'm curious just like how you think through Trump, because he does feel like, as much as this is a thing that has played out and repeated many times, it does seem like this one is in particular kind of different.
Maybe. I mean, I do think the parallels between Trump and Constantine are actually pretty interesting.
Yeah, maybe like Constantine might be the last time we've seen something like this. But at least in terms of like modern American political politics,
true.
this does seem like a little bit unique.
It is fascinating. I mean, although Reagan also fits this in many ways as somebody who had been divorced, and was pro-abortion when he was in California. Didn't fit the profile, but over Carter, who was an outspoken Baptist evangelical, right? So I do think there are some really interesting patterns here. But I mean, Trump. The thing about Trump, and I think the thing is to realize about the Orthodox, heresy kind of conversation is, it's really not about the doctrines. It's not about the way of life. It's not
Right.
about your morality. It's never been about that. It's about creating winners and losers. It's about articulating who's going to be in control and who's not going to be in control. And that's really what the construction of orthodoxy has always been. It's always been a way of deciding who has power. I mean, and we can see this in the history of Christianity. Athanasius, who was kind of the leader of orthodoxy, then got declared himself a heretic shortly afterwards. And then so because a different person was in charge, and then they got his position to be declared heretical, and then after that he got declared orthodox again. So the same position went back and forth. It volleyed back and forth between orthodoxy and heresy, and then orthodoxy again, within the span of one person's lifetime. And that's been the pattern all the way through. Is that the doctrines, the positions, the actual content is irrelevant. What is always relevant is who has the levers of power at their disposal and how are they going to use them. And evangelicals have been on a mission for quite some time now to be in control of those levers. And Trump has
Right.
decided that he's going to make that happen.
Yeah, I think we're even starting to see this now in the Christian nationalist movement, of Christian nationalists now starting to divide with each other about who gets to have the Christian in Christian nationalism. I know recently there was a huge debate between the more reformed Calvinist camp and the Catholics, because there's a huge disagreement about who is a true Christian there, or at least whose Christian nationalism gets to have the power. And so it's just interesting how eventually, I think it's inevitable that this question will ultimately get you to a point where you think you're a true Christian, and all of these other Christians that you thought were once true Christians are no longer true Christians because of one little piece of power that gets changed. And so I don't know if you have reflections on that, but that seems to be something where it's just, this is inevitable, especially in the Christian nationalist world, that we're going to see them starting to fight each other about who, even amongst those conservative Christian nationalists, about who's a true Christian.
And I would want to then disaggregate Christian nationalism into different groups here, because what we're seeing already is, you have like J.D. Vance belongs to the kind of the Catholic post-liberal Christian nationalist camp. But Trump isn't really surrounding himself with that crowd as much, even though they're the ones, in some ways, the intellectual hub
Right.
of Christian nationalism. Trump loves the what's called the New Apostolic Reformation, kind of the Pentecostal charismatic wing of Christian nationalism, where Trump doesn't fit them at all in terms of practice or religiosity, but he loves the charisma. He loves the kind of like vibrant,
The fake spray tans and stuff. Yeah.
yes, there's an image there, right? That is like it zeroes in on Trump's love of reality TV, his love of kind of gaudy extravagance. I mean, it's all of that stuff. He loves that, and so I think that's a natural home for him, and he's certainly been surrounding himself with that crowd of people. So even within Christian nationalism, we're seeing these different groups all sort of vying with each other over power. I think the one thing I also would want to add is that I do hear a lot of the sort of centrist, moderate types argue, oh, those Christian nationalists aren't really Christian, right? They always
Right.
keep referring to this, and I just want to keep reminding them, like, they are as Christian as you under any criteria here, because these criteria have always been in flux. There's never been some sort of clearly defined, obvious, self-evident criterion of what Christianity is. It's always been under construction, and the same mechanisms of orthodoxy and power are on display there as anywhere else. So under any definition, these people are Christian. We have to realize that Christianity is not one thing, and that's always been the source of these tensions.
Yeah, I wanted to bring that up because I know you had the article come out recently about making this argument that it is very problematic for maybe more progressive Christian types to argue that Christian nationalists aren't Christian, and I totally agree with you on this, by the way. But I am kind of curious, like, I do understand the impulse on this,
Oh, for sure.
of why they want to make this argument, because obviously, again, this is all about political power. And I will say that the conservative Christian world has gained a significant disproportionate influence because of this question and how they've navigated it. And I do kind of wonder, like, if we're just thinking from like a utilitarian standpoint, like maybe it could be potentially useful if like progressive Christians started making the own like that same argument, and maybe they could then get political power out of this. I don't know. Like, I'm curious to your thoughts around that, because I've had
Yeah.
that thought too of like, okay, like theologically, yes, I'm totally on board, but I'm sort of like from a utilitarian standpoint, like it does seem like a efficient and well tried and well evidenced way of navigating this if you want to gain political power.
I mean, I'm sympathetic. I definitely think that the Christian left should be involved in basically gaining political power. I'm not opposed to that at all. I don't think the Christian right has gained political power by leveraging the language of orthodoxy. That's where I would differ. So
Interesting.
I don't think that's been the way that they've achieved it. I think they've achieved it by savvy networking, right? Really, good marketing, savvy networking, laying the groundwork of the actual political groundwork of getting people into positions of power, getting people onto school boards, getting people elected to office. It's doing all of that groundwork. When I read Catherine Stewart's *The Power Worshippers* recently. It's a great book. It's a phenomenal history of kind of Christian nationalism right now. And I was reading the book and I was like, this is a really good template for activism. The things that these people are doing, people on the left ought to be doing. They're doing all the right things. They're doing it for terrible reasons, for terrible causes, for positions that are abhorrent. But the kind of activism that they are displaying is commendable and really ought to be a model for others to follow. But so that's all good. I think the politics are all fine. It's really, but I don't think the use of theology. I don't think that's been. I don't think that's been the way that's been attained.
Right.
I think that gets layered on afterwards as sort of an ex post facto sort of justification.
Yeah. Just to maybe make mention around just the conservatives and how they navigate this organizing. It is interesting. Like when I think of like the word, like if you tell me the word community organizer, immediately in my mind I think of somebody on the left. But like actually the best community organizers, at least over the last 50 years, have been conservatives, especially conservative Christians.
Yep.
Like the amount of disproportionate power that they've been able to leverage just because of the way that they community organize is. There's been nothing like it. They are absolutely unbelievable at it. Where I think we really need to like maybe rethink when we think of like activists or community organizers as like not people on the left, because it's the people on the right that are really damn good at it.
They are, and this is I think the biggest reason why I am concerned about the downfall of just church-going Christianity on the left. Is because the church networks are a huge base for that activism. And it always has been that way. I mean, if you go back to, 100, 150, 200 years ago, and you see like the Unitarians and these other, progressive groups, those churches were where that activism was happening. And as people have disaffiliated for very understandable and I think, largely good reasons, but we're not replacing it with another network of communities that can sustain that kind of community organizing.
Yeah. That's the thing about this that I think really is concerning. Like if you're a secular person, it absolutely should be concerning that the church, especially the progressive church, I think like if you just look from like a secular perspective of what the church has to offer the world, it is the fact that it might be one of the best spaces, at least initially, to start organizing, because you already have a group of people that are well connected with one another, that are already likely sharing some level of resources with one another, and for that to disappear and not have anything else to replace it is deeply concerning, and it should be deeply concerning with people who are non-Christian.
Yeah, I agree for sure. This is the problem with the Bowling Alone book, this kind of loss of social groupings that give us a platform to build networks, build connections, and spread our agendas and ideas. We're losing that, and social media cannot replace those
Yeah.
institutional brick and mortar communities that are largely disappearing.
Yeah. I want to get to kind of this group of left-leaning Christians that still, really love to make this argument of who is a true Christian and who isn't. But we've interacted with a lot of these folks on online spaces that are like maybe Anglican or Orthodox, or maybe in some cases Catholic. Some maybe even are Lutheran or Methodist. But they generally are people who might be very politically and maybe even to some degree very theologically left-leaning, but they still really care about orthodoxy, or have a concern about that. And I'm just curious, like, how you think through and navigate this, I would imagine, a fairly niche but very vocal group of Christians that clearly I think would disagree with you on this question of who is a true Christian, but like in almost any, for the most part, and theologically and politically in every other way, you would agree with them. So
Right.
I'm just really curious how you navigate that with that group of folks.
Yeah, that's probably a central target of my critique here in the book. I mean, I definitely tried to focus my book on kind of these mainline groups over the evangelicals because I wanted to sort of raise this issue. Yeah, the kind of weird Anglican Twitter kind of world, these spaces where orthodoxy is so essential. To me, I am certainly in common cause with them on a lot of political issues, but my response to them repeatedly is that they are unwittingly aiding and abetting the very forces that they're trying to counter in terms of the way that their rhetoric and their the kind of the intra Christian church politics that are involved with end up supporting what I call in my book a discourse coalition that is authoritarian. And that is the thing that I want. If people take away anything from my book, it's this. That is, you don't have to be an explicit card-carrying Christian nationalist to be aiding and abetting Christian nationalism. You can aid and abet it simply by being engaged in the same kind of authoritarian rhetoric and discourse that they're engaged with, but in normalizing that kind of policing of people's theology and doctrines. I think, I'm not going to say that the kind of heresy hunting that occurs on the Christian left is a one-to-one, simply aiding and abetting Trump directly, but I think it creates a culture within Christianity and a culture more generally that normalizes a certain kind of proto-Christian fascism.
How, I don't know why this question's coming up for me, but like, how do you navigate theological difference and like deciding like, okay, this is what we should believe as Christians, or this is what we shouldn't believe as Christians, if we're not basing it on some sort of historic authority of, certain creeds or doctrines or whatever? Like, how would you maybe prefer, or like, what would you suggest is maybe the better way for us to navigate the kind of question around, because you're definitely not suggesting like, oh, every theology is valid. Like, you're not suggesting that at all. So how should we navigate that kind of question around what kind of theology should we adopt for ourselves?
Yeah, I mean this is a complicated question, certainly beyond the scope of my book. So I touch on this idea of polydoxy towards the end of my book that is sort of an effort to kind of get this conversation up and running. But my overall view on this is, communities that gather together, however large or small they might be, I think each community can set the norms and rules and beliefs that are going to characterize that community. And there's a consent, right? It's a mutual consent to be a part of a community that shares a certain set of beliefs and practices. That should be totally acceptable and encouraged. And I think, so different quote unquote denominations or local churches or whatever should be able to kind of identify, here are the things that characterize us. So I think a lot of denominations, certainly the mainline ones, in practice already operate this way. What I think we need to avoid then is saying that we and we alone can lay claim to the label of Christian. Like, our set of beliefs and practices are alone the only ones that that, that we've staked, we've claimed that flag for ourselves. I think we need to get away from that talk, and we need to get away from the effort to sort of police that language, and so getting away from the law and order side of Christianity, which is always trying to make sure that people are towing a certain line, and that's so I want to get us away from that and more towards a culture of kind of consent and recognition of difference and plurality, that's a good thing. We can disagree, we can have different positions, we can have different ideas, and that doesn't define whether you are or not a member of this larger community of faith.
Yeah, I remember when I started really thinking through some of these questions, especially with people on the left, Christians on the left that were maybe making these arguments around like who is a true Christian, and you start asking them, what is it to, what is a true Christian? Like what does that require in terms of belief or practice or whatever? And what's interesting is I think a lot of times when they started to define that, they started to unintentionally, they started to leave Christians out that I think they would otherwise not want to leave out. For example, like if they're saying, okay, you have to believe the creeds. Well, okay, the Disciples of Christ, which has been a very historic denomination for the last 200 years, they're non-creedal. So are you going to kick those guys out? And I would imagine that you wouldn't look at someone like William Barber and say, oh no, he's not a Christian. So I'm like, okay, you unintentionally are going to kick that guy out. Or, I think the Quakers are always a really great example of an exception for a lot of rules. It's like, okay, well, they don't practice any of the sacraments, or at least they don't require the practice of the sacraments. So are you going to kick those guys out for not practicing the sacraments? And it's I think most people would probably consider the Quakers Christians, especially if you have any level of empathy around okay, we're going to try to, consider Lutherans and Presbyterians and Methodists all Christians. So it is one of those things where even Christians on the left that are wanting to kind of gatekeep this question, I think in a lot of cases, they often, when they start to define what they believe Christianity is, they unintentionally start to leave out people that I think they otherwise would consider Christians.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And it's actually really interesting to see the Quakers in particular, because there's infighting there, versus some of the conservative wing of the Quakers have aligned themselves with the evangelicals and have made things, certain ideas about marriage and sexuality, this litmus test for orthodoxy. So, which is really ironic, right? And this is really interesting, test case in terms of how even a denomination that has historically been avoidant of those kinds of uses of rules and tests can slide that way when the cultural pressures to do so are strong enough.
Yeah. How would you, I'm going to ask this question knowing that you're not going to answer it the way that you would imagine, but how would you define a Christian? And maybe let me give you some context around for example, somebody who is a committed lifelong Muslim, that would never identify themselves as a Christian, you probably wouldn't consider them a Christian, right? And so what would you say maybe is the requirement for someone to maybe rightfully be defined as a Christian? Because we know there are a lot of people that do, they would not be defined as a Christian, nor would they want to be defined as a Christian. So I'm just curious, we must be sort of, in some way, shape, or form, there's got to be some sort of operating way of defining that, even if it is a totally different way than a lot of even left-leaning Christians would.
It's a good question. I mean, and you're the first person to really ask me that outright, which is surprising. Okay, I'll give kind of a hazy answer at first, and then maybe complicate it. But I mean, I do think at some root level, we do have to allow for self-designation, So if I identify as a Christian, it's not anyone else's place to question that designation, based on criteria that they're going to erect as, arbitrary standards, right? So at some basic fundamental level, I think self-designation is a fundamental, rule. That being said, beyond that, I have what I think are some possible other criteria that we could put in place, but I wouldn't want to hold on to them too strongly. So, for instance, I think some sort of lack of a better word, spiritual or mystical attachment to Jesus of some kind, right? Some sort of sense that Jesus is of some importance, some significance for one's personal understanding and view of themselves and their way in the world, whatever that might look like. I'm really open to the vast plurality of what that might be, but some sense that Jesus has some place, right? And then beyond that, where I get much less fixed is on some kind of religious practice, some kind of participation. That's where I don't want to put any sort of firm boundaries on it. I think, so one of the things that really stimulated my thought on a lot of these issues was the issues of insider movements, which you might know as these movements of, say, somebody in a Muslim society that continues to go to mosque, but they have a personal attachment to Jesus and view themselves as both Muslim and Christian, for example. I think that's completely appropriate. Totally. And so those kinds of things are possible. And we need to figure out theologically how to make sense of that. What's the way to make sense of that? And I think using those kinds of limit cases can help us refine how we think about Christianity other places. But that's kind of where I would go.
Yeah. I remember maybe one of my first controversies on Twitter, I think it might have been right around like the beginning of the pandemic. So maybe people were just really, triggered because of the beginning of a pandemic. But I remember it was something where I tweeted something about like, I don't think there's like one kind of Christianity or something along those lines, right? And it was like the typical cast of characters that got mad at it. But I remember as I was navigating some of those conversations through kind of that moment, I was thinking through like what would I maybe define as Christianity? I think you put it spot on, like some sort of spiritual connection with Jesus. Seems to be fair, like a pretty good way to maybe describe that. Like, I mean, it's hard to just like, I'm trying to think of like, who would be an exception to that we would normally consider a Christian.
Yeah.
Right. I'm just like, I don't know if there's too many.
I'm not sure. Yeah. It would be pretty hard, I think, to find that, but yeah, I mean, I'm open to it. If somebody wants to respond and chime in and say, hey, here's another example, I'm fine with that. But that's kind of where I would start the conversation.
Yeah. I think you're right. I should have maybe asked this question earlier when we were talking about creeds, but I've got this question and a couple last questions. But how do you think through the creeds, given kind of your position on this? Like, I know you're much more in like the Episcopalian world where, more or less like creeds kind of matter. And so I'm just curious, like, I'm definitely like the kind of person where I'm not like anti-creeds at all, but I also think like they maybe to some degree maybe contribute to this whole this whole problem to begin with. So yeah, I'm just curious how you think through the creeds given this important question.
This might be where I am definitely not Episcopalian, because I'm more anti-creed than I think than certainly the average Episcopalian for sure. My view on this is what I like about the creeds, at least in the way that some of the denominations like the Episcopalians use them, is that they're not didactic about it. They're not saying like you have to believe this exactly in this way. This is one of the reasons why I like the liturgy of the Book of Common Prayer and other versions like it, is that the words themselves almost become transparent after a while, right? The actual words of the liturgy or the words of the creed, when you say it repetitively, it's like any sort of prayer, like any Catholic or Anglican prayer. After a while, the actual words themselves become nothing, right? And you sort of like travel through the words to some sort of spiritual depth beyond them. Now, I think that can happen with any prayer or any creed or any sort of ritual.
Honestly, the way you're describing this reminds me of people. I know I already talked about people with memory loss, but people with memory loss that like maybe their whole lives played the piano and they could forget everything else in their life, but all of a sudden you put them in front of a piano and they can just start playing a song that it's like in their bones. Yeah. And I think the creeds and just liturgy in general can be that for people. And that's why I in the midst of like our doubts, our questions, our disbelief even, like it's still something that like can carry us through in connection with other Christians.
Yeah, I
Anyway,
agree.
I
I mean,
interrupted
it's
you, but like that's
no,
how
I
I
mean,
think through it.
I view the same thing. I mean, doesn't have to be that. I mean, I think for a lot of people in sort of Baptist or evangelical homes, it might be a hymn, or it might be
A silly song with Larry.
exactly right, precisely, some sort of worship song. Uh, or in my home growing up, it was memorizing Bible verses. I knew a lot of biblical verses from memory because that was the kind of home I grew up in, and the verses, whatever they might be, just became that kind of anchor point. So that's sort of how I view the creeds. That is, it serves a sort of psychological function of connecting one to something larger than themselves and becoming the vehicle or the window to a spiritual reality beyond it. Now, so that's where I would say I'm very much okay with them. Where I get very concerned is when the creeds get used as this kind of eternal litmus test for
Right.
Christian identity and belief, and that's where I think the creeds can be really dangerous. And I think this is true for almost any confession, because every confession, every creed is for a time and a place. It was written in a specific historical moment,
Yeah.
and the moment you try to turn it into a trans-historical, eternal, rule for all time, you abstract from that situation. And like the Nicene Creed or the Barmen Declaration even only really makes sense in the cultural and historical moment in which it was written.
Yeah.
And if you try to make that into some sort of all time, all places guideline, you really end up falsifying it. So
Right.
that's where creedalism I want to resist very strongly.
Well, I think and I've navigated this with people on Twitter as well, where I think one of the huge problems that the way that people use the creeds as sort of this litmus test is we got to be honest with ourselves. Like the creeds are written more like poetry. They're not an exhaustive systematic theology that details the way that you have to believe the word resurrection here, right? A systematic theology might be able to very clearly articulate what it means by the word resurrection, but the creeds are not trying to do that. So to then place upon the creeds this sort of systematic, well-articulated theology that's very clear and precise is just not how the creeds are written. And so you end up you give it some sort of you make it some sort of litmus test when the creeds themselves are not written to be some sort of litmus test at all.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, well, I will say the creeds were originally written as a litmus test for sure. So
Right.
I think they are. I think they were in that point in time. They did serve that function. Homoousios certainly had a litmus test function in that period. Yeah, but you're right. Over time, it became poetry. It became something that you could just say, and those debates were from hoary antiquity, right? They were no longer live questions anymore. And I think that's where, in some ways, like getting to that point, it's fine at that stage when it becomes poetry, but we have to remember it began as a violent text. It began as a way to oust one's political opponents, and we can't. I don't want to lose sight of that. I think it's important to kind of keep that function in mind, so we don't kind of get too lulled into this notion that it's just a creed. We're just saying a creed. It's just this is what Christians have always believed. Well, no, it certainly wasn't what some people believed in the 4th century, and we don't want to lose sight of the fact that there were people who were killed over it. And so.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, I just want to. That's something I always want to keep in view here. Is that yes, creeds can have that function, but I also wonder: are there other things that could function that way that don't function as a creed? That are not creeds.
Yeah, agreed. Last question, or last couple questions here, David. How do you hope that this book and this work, and just thinking through this question, how do you hope it inspires and liberates its readers and people that engage with it?
I mean, I really just hope to have a more honest and open conversation about these issues, because I have been, both the recipient of this kind of occupational violence, but also I've had many friends, Tom Ord being one of them, over the years, who have experienced this kind of policing of these boundaries, the kind of law and order wing of Christianity. And I, besides the fact that it is supportive of authoritarianism, and that's a problem, it's also just a really bad witness for Christianity, I think. So I just want Christians to be better, to love better, to live better, to find more peaceful, harmonious ways of being in community with each other and learning how to accept difference and not always try to squash those differences and create some artificial uniformity. Let's allow Christianity to be as diverse and complicated as it is, and I think that could make the world a better place.
Yeah. Yeah, I always kind of get a little kind of pissy when people say, all religion is love, or love is the way to define all religion or whatever. And I'm like, I get pissy about that, and I'm guessing most of the left-leaning Christian people that give us shit probably also would get a little pissy about that too. And it's like, but for whatever reason, they're totally willing to do that with Christianity.
Yes, it's exactly right.
So anyway, David, how do you hope, or how would you like people to get connected to you and your work, and where should people get the book?
Well, these days I'm on Blue Sky. I've largely left the Twitter platform behind, and so find me there at dwcongdon.com. That's my handle. You can get the book either at Cambridge University Press's website or other retailers online or anywhere else. But otherwise, feel free to reach out to me. I have a website, dwcongdon.com, and love to hear people's thoughts and questions.
Love it. Love it. Well, thank you so much for chatting more about the book. I don't know why it's taken me so long to chat with you about it, but I'm just really stoked about it. I think it's just really an important book for our time and age. So thank you so much for chatting about it.
Thanks, Mason.